So a little over 6 years ago, Marshall Saunders approached me and said, I need you to come help me with this organization. And I'd known Marshall for a long time. And I'd known Marshall a lot through his results work. I knew that he had initiated over 1 million microcredit loans, that he significantly worked on poverty. And he said, I started this new organization and I need you to come help me run it. And it took me a while to get my head around what he was talking about, but finally we were having breakfast one day and I said, Marshall, so what you're telling me is you want to work on Congress and global warming at the same time? And he's like, yeah, this is going to be great. I'm like, those are the two most screwed up things on the planet. And you want to combine them? I have never heard of anything that sounds like more of a recipe for disaster. So Marshall's nothing if not persistent, and just stayed at it and stayed at it and stayed at it. So eventually I told him that I would take a 6-month leave of absence from my company. Most of my work in the last 30 years has been in the area of human performance and productivity. And that I felt like if I helped him get this up and going, I would have a good conscience to say I did my part. And then I could go back to trying to pay for 3 kids going away to college. Because it was expensive. And education is important in my view, so that's one of the things that you do invest in, right? So my first day at work, I came in and there were 6 CCL chapters and 24 volunteers then. And Marshall said, here's your desk, here's your phone. We need a bunch more of those chapters. I'm not going to look over your shoulder. Good luck. Now, personally, I like working that way. So I thought, this is great. I love being left alone because I think I can do things if people leave me alone. So he came back about 2 hours later and he said, oh, by the way, if we were to take a particular orientation, I think we could draw it from this particular book on Gandhi. And he opened up the page to this one anecdote. He was reading a book by Ashwaran about Gandhi the man, about his personal transformation. And the anecdote was about when Gandhi went to South Africa to meet with General Smuts. So this is before he goes to India. And he's been asking for a meeting with General Smuts for quite some time. And finally Smuts grants him an audience, and there's Smuts over 6 feet tall in his military uniform, and in walks Gandhi, almost 5 feet tall. And Gandhi says, I'm here to tell you that I'm intending to oppose your government. Smuts says, really, you? Anything else I should know since you're here? And Gandhi says, oh yes, I'm going to prevail. Now, Smuts is incredulous. And he says, and how do you plan to do that? And Gandhi says, your help. So, fast forward, so that's become a big part of the CCL story, is kind of finding commonality with people, finding out how we can work with people. So I want to fast forward to 2 weeks ago. Jay Butera, one of our volunteers, who is a retired businessman from Pennsylvania, has decided to adopt the Florida delegation because so much of what's happening with global warming is so immediate in Florida. During high tide, the ocean washes back up through the sewers into the streets. And he's developed a great relationship with Senator Rubio's office. And Senator Rubio, I don't know how much you follow global warming, but of all the goofy things that members of the Senate and House have been saying about global warming, Marco Rubio's way up there. And every time they ask him for clarification, it gets worse, not better. So Jay's in there 2 weeks ago, and he said, yesterday I met with Lauren Reamy, our new contact of Senator Marco Rubio's DC office. As you know, despite the Senator's high-profile opposition to climate action, we continue to maintain a cordial relationship with his DC office. I started the meeting following the CCL principles of appreciation and respect, but when I finished explaining why our Schultz-Becker carbon fee and dividend plan is the conservative way to reduce climate risk, Schultz being former Secretary of State Schultz, which is, it helps, he's on our board, being able to go to a Republican office and saying, we're talking about a former Republican Secretary of State's plan. When I finished explaining why our Schultz-Becker carbon fee and dividend plan is the conservative way to reduce climate risk, Lauren paused the conversation. She looked at me and asked, and just how do you expect to move this bill through this Congress? And of course, at that moment, the CCL parable of Gandhi and General Smuts flashed and played in my head. I've heard that story so many times, and there it was, happening live. So before I knew it, I said the answer we all knew so well. With your help, I told her. Lauren was totally taken aback. She laughed and she asked me, and who in this Senate do you think can introduce this bill? Trying my best to channel Gandhi and all of CCI, I told her, we think Senator Rubio will introduce this bill. And at that moment, when I was saying that, I truly believed it to be possible. And I think even Lauren herself believed it to be possible, at least for a moment. You know, she said, I'm not sure that's going to happen right now, but I really admire your confidence and positive attitude. We laughed about it, continued to have a great conversation, and she asked me if I would come back again next month to continue the dialogue. So that's my short answer to the question you were all answering before we took the break. And then the other thing that's what would be a personal breakthrough is if I could find myself spending more time convinced that members of Congress want to do the right thing rather than just serve their own self-interest, I think that would be a breakthrough that would be worthwhile of my time here. So as I said, I don't come to this from community activism. I don't come from it from the nonprofit world. I come from it from working on how do you improve performance and productivity and effectiveness. And the last thing I was doing before I came to Citizens Climate Lobby was working at an organization called Mission Control. And my primary clients were Boeing and NASA. And I was working with top-level scientists and engineers, the most busy people in the organization, trying to see how you can improve their performance. And we found that to work with them in a way that there would be any lasting impact, there had to be 3 levels you worked on with people. And I'm going to just show you this little, really exciting, advanced, and very artistic chart. The inner circle says tools. So we did need to give people new tools. We did used to say, you know, you used to do this. Don't do that anymore, do this. But then, if we were to offer a new tool, the second level we had to work on was developing new work habits. Because if you decide you're going to take on a new practice, if you don't reinforce it somewhere between probably 24 and 30 times, you're not going to do it. So what we were saying is if you're not going to develop the new work habit that goes with this, there's really no reason to even try the new habit. But then the third level was really the only thing that mattered, and that was the context in which people worked. And if we couldn't impact that, we couldn't have any impact on people at all. And work is a really interesting context to work with people on. Close to the 1980s, there was a book came out called Megatrends. Anybody remember hearing about that, Megatrends? Yeah. Well, one of the things that they observed in Megatrends is people spend the vast majority of their life at work. Probably somewhere between 70 to 80% of their time at work. So it's not just the time at the office, it's going to the office, it's coming home from the office, it's bringing work home from the office, it's dreaming about work, it's about having nightmares about work. Mm-hmm. People are obsessed with their work. But for most people, they only expect to get about 15% of what's meaningful or fulfilling of their life from work. So they're spending their vast majority of their time at something where they're not going to be personally enriched or fulfilled. And you can see how that would lead most people at some point to come to the realization, what was the point of all that? Sure, there was a trade-off for a paycheck. Yeah, we need a paycheck to get by. But is that enough? So the first thing we really went to work on is, can you find meaning in your work? Can you be personally fulfilled by designing that piece for Boeing better, more efficiently? And once we found that we could get people to find that there was more meaning in their work, that the natural effectiveness stuff kind of happened easily. Okay. So everything I've done in the last 6 years has been an attempt to change the context in which the people who are working on global warming are working on it. And what I'm going to do is simply walk you through some of those things. The existing context or paradigm was fear and impending doom. That's where we started. So the people who work on global warming are mostly traumatized about what they're afraid is about to happen, and that we're leaving the planet a total disaster that there's almost nothing we can do about. Now we know enough about brain science now, don't we, that people functioning from fear are using a very small capacity of themselves, right? So we know enough to know that the fear part is kind of the fear or flight part, and that we've developed much greater capacities over time. So could we find a way of expanding the depth of which people brought themselves to the issue? And so Sam kind of pointed to one of the things is we early on tried to bring a lot of joy and celebration to what was happening. So every time a letter to the editor was published earlier, I would lose my mind. I would call the person I would read excerpts from it. Can you believe someone published something like this? This is the most remarkable thing I've ever seen. Has anybody ever done something like this? And it was simply to try and elevate people out of the existing paradigm. Okay? Now, an absolutely essential piece of this that we could have no chance of success is without the results model. So the results model gave us at least 2 things. One, it gave us a structure. So first of all, there was a structure already that said, if you organize people by congressional district, if you gave them a structure of support, so if they did something last month, they would do something this month, and then if you actually trained them, You couldn't give people talking points. You had to find an interesting way every month to get people to rehearse what they were saying so they internalized the comments so that they were comfortable speaking in any situation. So first of all, we could take a structure that had already proven it was successful, and if you look at us, I mean, it's hard to find a difference. The only difference between the purpose statements of CCL and results is poverty and climate. It's like, we didn't say, oh, we'll modify a little bit here. It was almost an attempt to exactly replicate something. But here's the other thing having the results model did for us. It gave people a way of dealing with this issue where they could predict success, or at least hope for success. Because everybody else was throwing spaghetti at the wall on this issue. And we said, look, this model has worked, so what it did was actually gave people a different context to work in. So I spent the last 35 years working in the arena of increasing performance and a lot inside companies, but to the public. Some associates of mine, I never did this work, but some associates of mine decided to see if that methodology would hold up in Southeast Los Angeles with the Crips and the Bloods. And so they started doing workshops there. And what we thought we would find when we got there, by we, I mean my associates, we thought that why their behavior was so crazy and violent was because they had had such bad lives. What we discovered was they saw no future for themselves. And if you saw no future, if there was no opportunity for you, if nothing could turn out, it would make sense to be crazy and violent, right? So what we said right then is, well, that's interesting, but I wonder if that applies anywhere else. Is it possible that anywhere else the future is actually more important to who people are right now than the past? So we started to apply it everywhere we were working on effectiveness. We started applying it in corporations. We started applying it in our work with just individuals in their life. Could you have them see a world that they were working towards that was better than the one that they had? And that we found that working on the future actually had more impact on improving people's productivity than working on the past. Sure, people who have deep psychological issues need to do some work, right? And therapy and all those kinds of things. But for most people, if you can change the future they're working towards, it changes everything today. And results did that for us. So we took these people who were traumatized by impending doom, who said, holy cow, we might pull this off. And so that was an absolutely essential piece. It wasn't just the structure. It was to be able to have a story that had people having the potential of success. Now I'm going to ask you to work in the context we work in, which we're working on global warming in a very simple policy. And so we have tried to work very hard to be an organization that works in relationship to what it's for, rather than what it's against. I think it's lazy and sloppy to only know who you disagree with and what you don't like. Now, everybody's seduced by that. It's why talk radio and the cable shows are so popular, is because, it's so comforting to know that the people you disagree with are jerks. I can't help it. I have some of that addiction. I love to turn on them and say, oh yeah, see, they're stupid, we're good. It's seductive, but it's lazy. So what we said is let's see if we can force ourselves to work in relationship to what we're in favor of, what we want. So I'm going to ask you to do an exercise. And this is the first exercise we ask every CCL volunteer to do. And that is to simply identify something very specific that you love about this planet. Now again, I'm going to do this in my context. So we don't know exactly everything that's going to be damaged by global warming, but we have a pretty good idea. Pretty much what the scientists have predicted is what's happening. So you can have a pretty good idea. In fact, just read this to you. In 1969, in an interview in the New York Times, okay, there I have too many papers. E.B. White said, every morning I wake torn between a desire to save the world and an inclination to savor it. This makes it hard to plan today. But if we forget to savor the world, what possible reason do we have for saving it? In a way, the savoring must come first. So I'm going to ask you to do an exercise to identify something that you've savored, that you want to make sure is around for future generations, that has the potential of being jeopardized by climate change. So I'm going to use the context of what we're working on. I'll give you a simple example for me. When I was a little kid, my favorite thing to do in summer in Salt Lake City, where I grew up, was to wander the neighborhood eating fruit off my neighbor's trees with my brother John and our neighbor Steve Hill. And first of all, anything you eat that ripens on a tree tastes a lot better than what you buy in the store, doesn't it? Now, if you have to jump a fence to get it, doesn't it make it taste a little bit better? So like one fence over was apricots, 2 fence lovers was a huge cherry tree. You could be there forever. And we know those people were never home during the day. So you could get up from that tree for hours at a time. So there were grapes across the street, and my favorite tree was this plum tree that was about a block away up a hill, and it was only, you know, a few steps off the sidewalk, so you never had to worry about a crabby old man or a dog. You know, you could just get a plum and then eat it. And it was the ones that have the deep purple fruit in it. So I have been planting fruit trees in my backyard for 30 years. And my kids are all in their late 20s, one in their 30s. So I wasn't planting it so much for them, even though they did enjoy some of it. But I wanted their kids to have the experience of what it was like to eat something fresh off of a tree. It's just different. It's an experience people should have, right? So I planted one of those plum trees, and it made plums for 4 years. And then 5 years ago, it stopped making plums. So I took a branch to my local nursery. I live in San Diego, and I said, what's the problem? Usually they say there's this disease and you have to treat it in this way. And what they said is, it just doesn't get cold enough in the winter in San Diego any longer for that plum tree to go through the cycle it needs to go through. So most fruit trees need a certain number of hours under 45 degrees to go through the cycle to make fruits, and it just doesn't stay cold in San Diego in the winter anymore. So they said unless the San Diego winters start to get cold, that tree's just never going to make fruit again, and it hasn't. It's hanging in there. It's not going to live much longer because it needs not only that to make fruit, but to live. So in the big picture, my little fruit tree, who cares? But there's 2 reasons I want to do this exercise with you. One is to identify something specific you love, but also to begin to make a case that we're making all the time for where we can find common ground with other people. So I'm just going to ask you to pair up. So if we can go like, let me see, 2, 2, 2, 2. Erica, can you come to the here?
Sure.
Okay, good. And all I want you to do is just identify something specific that has the potential of being jeopardized by climate change, that you want to make sure is around for future generations. The more specific answer, the better. And if you just gaze over at your partner and whoever has the most romantic eyes, you go first. Okay?
I've done this before. I'll go first because I picked one.
So we do the exercise for a couple of reasons. One is to establish a basis of how we're trying to do our work, which is, can we always be working in relationship to what we're in favor of versus what we're against? But also to know that we have things in common with people that we disagree with ideologically who love the planet the way we do. So for instance, I don't know why it is, but if your last name's Warner, it seems like it's almost by default you get elected to the Senate in Virginia. And a couple of iterations ago, there was a Senator Warner who didn't seem interested in anything on environmental issues, who got very interested, and we were curious and finally found out that he loves trout fishing, and that trout are very sensitive to changes in temperature. So it was something personal that affected him, and he became very, very interested. So we could start in that love of something in nature and build from that. I was talking to Barry Goldwater's son the other day, and he talked about how often his father used to take him hiking. And he'd take him out and he'd say, you know, son, this pine tree has more character than most of the people you'll meet in your life. You know? So we can always start there as something that we have in common with people. So the first time we went to Washington, it was just Marshall Saunders, our founder, Danny Richter and I. And it was right when the Waxman-Markey vote was happening, 2009. And we thought that cap and trade was a really, really bad idea and that carbon tax was a better solution. So we went into offices of Democrats who were committed to voting for that bill, telling them how stupid they were to vote for that bill and how much smarter they would be if they took our position. And we went into Republicans and said why they should be for a new tax. And you know how much people love being told they're stupid. So they treated us politely, but basically said, don't let the door hit you on the way out. So we decided that night maybe we need to reevaluate. And so I just reflected back to the first day at the office and the book Marshall gave me about Gandhi, and I said, well, how about tomorrow we go, and the only thing we do is try and see if we can find something we have in common with them, and once we have something in common with them, see if we can build from there. Let's just see if we can do that. I mean, we can't be worse than we were yesterday. So certainly that approach we know is bankrupt. Let's try something else. And the meetings were magic. And it scared the crap out of me. Because I had said, I'm in for 6 months, but this is way too hard an issue for me. Global warming's too hard. Congress is too hard. Nobody can deal with this. And I had a glimpse that we could succeed. So then what do? You know, do you just give your 6 months and then say, well, I did my part, you know, back to making sure I can pay for my way through kids through college? And so I actually did not want to hit that moment. I wanted to find out that it was impossible and go home so I could say to my friends, I tried, but it was too hard. But it was that moment of saying, if we started by trying to find something in common with people, it gave us a chance of success. So I went back to my employer and said, this isn't a leave of absence, I'm all in, this might work, okay? I want to share with you how somebody else answered this question. He wasn't asked it the way you and I were, but he answered the question we were just answering. During the Apollo mission in 1969, astronaut Rusty Schweickart was let out of the capsule on an umbilical cord. Usually NASA keeps the astronauts compulsively busy up there, but a peculiar thing happened to Schweickart. Just as he emerged from the capsule, something went wrong within the capsule. Both Mission Control in Houston and the remaining astronauts had to concentrate on the problem. This left Rusty all alone, floating around Mother Earth in complete cosmic silence. During the time, Rusty had 2 profound conversion experiences. He looked back at Mother Earth, a shining gem against a totally black backdrop, and realized everything he cherished was on that gem. His family and land, music and human history with its folly and its grandeur. He was so overcome that he wanted to hug it and kiss the gem the way a mother does her firstborn. Compassion flowed through him. Trained as a jet fighter pilot, he was a typical macho man. But a breakthrough of something bigger came washing over at him that moment in space. Schweikart's second awakening in space was a political one. He was a red, white, and blue American who believed what he'd always been taught. The world was divided between the communist world and the free world. Yet while floating around Mother Earth, he saw that rivers flowed indiscriminately between Russia and Europe. That ocean currents served communist, socialist, and capitalist nations alike. The clouds did not stop at borders to test for political ideology. And that there are no nations. Nations exist in the mind of the human race alone. On returning to NASA, Schweickart was not debriefed by any spiritual director about his mystical experiences. He confesses to having wandered around in a state of stupor for 6 months, bumping into walls while asking himself repeatedly this one question: why did God do this to me? Finally, he concluded that God did this through him, so that others might hear the message. What message? Compassion, interdependence, shared beauty on this shining, glistening planet. The holy earth. We must take such care of it. It must take such care of us. This side of heaven, where each of us so nearly all the other has, there is darkness all around us, yet between us, there is just enough light to get by. So I like what Rusty Schweickart says, because his background, his ideological view of the world, probably didn't start where ours does. And so what we've tried to say is, what if we always start with what we have in common with people? What we have in the commonality of loving this planet and just starting there, or loving people. You know, I don't know how familiar you are with Jim Inhofe. Jim Inhofe wrote a book saying global warming is the biggest farce ever imposed upon the American public. But I know he loves his kids and his grandkids. I know that. And I know we can start there with him. You know, our group went for the first meeting down to his office and they say, what do we say? You know, it's Inhofe. I said, just walk in there and say, we come in peace. Let's see where we can go from there. All right, I have one other exercise I want to do with you. And again, this is another attempt to see if we can get outside of the context in which we're working. So this is something Charles Reich wrote from something called Power and the Law. In both the CCL and results purposes, there talks about a breakthrough in personal and political power. And so this is the most pure expression of what we mean when we talk about people having breakthroughs in their personal and political power. What he says to me is, power means to me pretty much the same thing as freedom. Power is the thing everybody wants the most they can possibly have of. That is, skiing is power. Sex appeal is power. The ability to make yourself heard by your congressperson is power. Anything that goes out of you and goes into the world is power. And in addition to that, listen to this is what he's calling power. The ability to be open. To appreciate. He's calling that power, to appreciate. To receive love, to respond to others. To listen to music, to understand literature. All of that is power. By power, I mean human faculties exercised to the largest possible degree. So in a large way, in a large sense, by power, I mean individual intelligence. Now, when you reach out to another person through the energy or creativity that is in you, and that other person responds, you're exercising power. I think he says all that so he can say this last sentence. He says, when you make somebody else do something against their will, to me, that is not power at all, that is force. And force to me is the negation of power. He says, when you make somebody else do something against their will, to me, that is not power at all, that is force, and force to me is a negation of power. Okay, my assertion is that when you experience other people's power or your own, you're enhanced by that experience. You're made a better person. Whereas when you're forced to do things, or you force people to do things, you're diminished by that experience. So I'm going to ask you to do a little bit harder exercise now than the first one, which is to identify what has been a time in your life where you've either experienced power and being enhanced by it, or force and being diminished by it. You know, a lot of us who are parents have had the experience of making our kids stuff and do stuff. It's never satisfying, so that's kind of simple. So see if you can find something harder than that. But let me give an example for me. So we have a monthly call, just like results. Ours is the first Saturday of the month, theirs is the second Saturday of the month. We do the same three things they do. So one of our speakers was this woman named Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. Dr. Hayhoe is a Canadian-trained climate scientist who teaches at Texas Tech University. She's evangelical, and her husband is an evangelical pastor. It was after they'd been married for 6 months that she discovered that her husband believed that the earth was 6,000 years old. She's been studying hundreds of thousands of years and millions of year trends. And finds out her husband believes the earth is 6,000 years old. She says, on this matter, we have just agreed to disagree. Which I find is an extraordinary statement that someone could make. He's come around over time now. But anyway, so when she was on our call, she talked to us about how every religion, and particularly the evangelicals, tells them that they should be good stewards of the planet, and they know they're not doing it. So this was an expert climate scientist who wasn't talking to us about science. And it was like shattering my brain cells, every single thing she said. Because I had believed up until then, if you were working on the issue I'm working on it, you had to come through it through science. That was the only valid way to come to it. And you know, sometimes people will tell you you're stupid and you're small-minded, and all you can say is, well, you're stupid and small-minded, and you have bad breath, so you're worse than me. But sometimes people will work with you where you discover you're being small-minded, right? You're just not being as big as you could be on the issue. And that's what happened to me and all of Citizens Climate Lobby, is we said, wow, we're being puny in our thinking. If we broadened our thinking, if we opened ourselves up to people coming to us on their terms rather than ours, here's all these people that want to help. But what we've been saying, you can only help if you do it on the terms that we've established, which is the science. So that was an experience for me of pure, raw power. Who's someone who changed my life, the whole time just smiling and being loving. And she also has this thing that she says that I love. She says, when you function from fear, your attention is the exact wrong place that it should be because it's on yourself. When you function from your love, you have your attention everywhere it should be, which is the people other than you. So anyway, that was an example for me of experiencing someone's power and actually becoming a way better human being from their, what we would call power, okay? The definition we're trying to get at, the Charles Reich definition. So I'm going to ask you to pair up with your partner again and see if you can identify what's an example where you experienced yours or someone else's power and being enhanced by it, and or where you experienced being forced or forcing someone and being diminished to it. So we'll switch roles, so this would mean the less romantic guys, you go first this time. Around and just get a 30-second example from each person of some place where you experienced power. Just a second. One of the ones that really kind of got me was I was starting one of our chapters in Phoenix, and pastor of church was there, and he said we were having a discussion about how we were going to relate to same-sex couples in our church. There was a lot of controversy in the congregation. And he said, I had enough votes to get it through right then and just say we were going to be tolerant. But I decided to set up a process that took over a year and that everybody was heard. And he said, if I would have taken the vote today, we would have gotten 70% of the congregation voting for it. When we took the vote a year later, 100% of the congregation did. That to me is an expression of pure power, of finding a way to include people, to hear people, where you end up with nobody feels like they got the raw end of the deal, right? Okay, so can you give a 30-second example of something?
The example I used was going through labor the second time,
Uh-huh.
after going through labor the first time where I didn't feel powerful, but the second time I did, and we talked briefly around, like, kind of was a combination of knowing what to expect, training myself ahead of time, and having a different attitude going into it meant it was a much more empowering experience.
Wow, nice, thank you.
And we talked a little more generally also about working with volunteers and the balance between guidance and space.
Aha.
We give them a lot of materials and a lot of structure, but they're also bringing a lot of themselves and their own choice. So that finding that sweet spot is going to take a little time.
That's really, really good. I want to talk about that in about 15 or 20 minutes also. Yeah.
And for me, it's observing power, like the story we read about the congressman who voted against famine aid, but then they took 2 years to connect, and there was this power out of that. And you see it all the time in the actions of individuals that we all work with.
So the example that I gave was the first pastor who I worked with at a church who had an amazing way of making everybody get involved and do things that they didn't know they wanted to do. And when I would be at a social justice meeting for the first time or talk to somebody who was a new leader of a committee, about half the time the answer of how did they get here was, I don't know, I was walking with Father Jerry through the parking lot, and the next thing I knew, I'm the head of the Africa Outreach Committee. And you could just hear that story over and over again. And I think that was a really great example of power.
Yeah, beautiful.
I mean, the one we shared was one experience of power that was intended to diminish us, and then it ended up motivating us to continue the work we were doing. We were working on this international advisory committee, and we had this council member, excuse me, who stood up and kind of made a comment, condescending comment that immigrant leaders that were advocating for representation, equality on that board, on the committee, actually are more concerned with going to work and coming back to the community and celebrating. We could not do this kind of sophisticated work that is working on the committee, so we don't have that capacity. But we have people who were PhD holders, who were masters in that community that are working, that we're doing. So, and then she kind of made a veiled threat that, well, if we don't want to work within what they already have, which is having people who are American born to lead and for us to learn, then their committee could just be dissolved that way. So that is kind of way that made us feel like, well, this is some fight that we need to fight to the end. And somebody stood up within our group and said that, well, we're not going back to what we're doing, we're moving forward, and we're going to get the IEC be more representative. And at the end, and that's what happened. So the power of her trying to diminish it, but made us more.
Thank you.
Motivated.
Just some recent examples of some coalition work we've been doing on introducing a piece of legislation on maternal and child health. And we've got a large coalition of people who are trying to get leadership behind the bill. And I've worked on organizing a number of these calls in different parts of the country. And the people on the call with our coalition, all have the, .org email addresses, and then our volunteers have their Gmail addresses and all that. So for me, it's like seeing our volunteers lead those meetings in a couple of cases, actually secure the meetings with members of Congress themselves, and actually lead the organizing meetings with all of the .org people, along with their Gmail addresses. And that's, for me, that's great. That's power.
Yeah.
Mine does overlap about children. So I have 3 sons, and when I was working with refugees in Vermont, the primary group was Sudanese youth. And at the time, my oldest son was about 15, so very close in age. And I, because of the way life was organized, often the children came with me if there was an event or to help furnish an apartment or do something. And one night after dinner, it was my oldest turn to do the dishes, and of course he wandered off, forgetting that task. And I said, "Hey, you're on dishes tonight." And he came in and looked at me and said, Mom, I know I didn't have to walk across Africa but I still don't want to do the dishes. But I knew then that he had learned the
Yes.
lessons of life that were important to me.
Yeah. That's so
And
great.
he was still gonna.
Yes. And he was still a teenager.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's lovely, thanks.
An example I used was I have a friend who like is pretty much politically opposite from me on every issue, and we've learned to just talk slowly about like the Real Housewives of Atlanta and like if zombies exist. But there was one night that we were hanging out, and all of a sudden he was just like, "I want to convince you on why gun rights is important to me."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay. And I think he like was kind of shocked by that. And just like, I don't know, just like it empowered me that I could like humanize him and humanize his view, and understand that like he had experiences and perspective that made him decide the way why he wanted to be like that. And yeah, I think that was just like really empowering for me.
Yeah. Interested in where people would express and experience and enhance their power. I want to share an example. This is Jessica Langerman from Wellesley, Massachusetts. And she wrote, "At some point over the past few decades, I surrendered my citizenship. Not literally or consciously, but slowly, through apathy, ignorance, and neglect. I gave away my civic inheritance. One too many lost environmental battles had made me feel not only besieged, but impotent. The insidious conviction that I really had no political power or not enough to affect transformative change took root in my mind. Until I joined Citizens Climate Lobby, modeled after the incredibly successful anti-poverty campaign results, the Citizens Climate Lobby refuses to accept that our democracy is broken. Instead, it organizes and educates ordinary Americans to become effective lobbyists focused like an intractable laser beam on the passage of just one piece of legislation, 100% revenue-neutral carbon tax. Pie in the sky? You might think so, but you would be wrong. Over the last year, the notion that a revenue-neutral carbon tax could be the way out fossil fuels has gained momentum. From the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, from Harvard's own Greg Mankiw, Mitt Romney's recent economic advisor, to John Riley at MIT. Economists across the political spectrum agree that in order to avert the impending climate crisis, we must put an accurate price on carbon. 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to see CCL in action when I attended a week-long conference and lobbying campaign in Washington, D.C. On Sunday, I joined over 400 other volunteers from across the country at Washington's Liaison Hotel in 90-degree-plus heat. Seminars with titles like Effective Meetings on the Hills and Listening Skills for Activists were already underway, revealing how CCL works its magic through the power of building relationships. After 2 days of classes and preparation, each CCL volunteer was given a list of meetings he or she was to attend over the next few days with various members of Congress or their legislative aides. We would go together in groups of 5 or 6, but the individuals within each group would change from meeting to meeting as CCL to try to match up volunteers with constituencies. One person in each group was designated as leader, and the rest of us would volunteer to take up other roles, such as person with the ask, the note-taker, timekeeper, or fact expert. We were given brief biographies of our members of Congress so we could familiarize ourselves with their environmental records and begin each meeting by finding something to appreciate them about, even if it was only the fact that they were hardworking and accurate representatives for their constituents. This non-confrontational, open, and respectful approach is critical to CCL's success. My first meeting with Joseph was with Joseph Kennedy's office. At the appointed hour, our band of 6 opened the door to a small but beautiful old office where an aide greeted us pleasantly and seated us all around a small table. Our leader for that meeting, Rabbi Judy Weiss from Brookline, hewed to the CCL line by first thanking Eric for the meeting with us and then asking each of us to introduce ourselves by briefly explaining what had brought us here. The human storytelling element broke the ice and allowed us to proceed in a more relaxed manner. Judy made a point of explicitly appreciating Representative Kennedy's record to date before we stated our purpose, that we wanted the congressman to propose or co-sponsor carbon tax legislation. We explained why and then asked the aide for his thoughts on our proposition. The aide seemed surprised and gratified to be asked his opinion. He was sympathetic to the notion of a carbon tax, but depressed and discouraged about its chance for passage. This attitude of dejected frustration we came to realize was endemic among the congressional staffers with whom we spoke on both sides of the aisle. Normally, at such point in a conversation about carbon taxation, I would probably agree that ours was a hopeless mission, thanked my listener, and quietly tiptoed away. But not this time. Absolutely no one else at the table was leaving, so I could hardly slink out the door. Instead, Judy and the others simply said, "We can do this and we're here to help you." To prove her point, Judy told the aide that our organization, founded in 2008, last year only had 33 chapters. This year we have over 100. We have published letters and op-eds by the hundreds in publications all over the United States and Canada. Judy explained that the 400 people, all volunteers, were at that moment meeting with senators and representatives all over the Hill in support of this measure. It's our job, Judy said, to build this political will, and we will. Finally, we asked the staffer, whom does Representative Kennedy work with on the other side of the aisle? This was to help us identify potentially sympathetic Republicans, but also to signal that we expect our politicians to be able to work with someone in the opposite party. At the end of the meeting, we thanked the aide and then regrouped outside the office. How had it gone? What had we done well? What could we do better in the next meeting? Some of us were continuing together, others peeled off to different locations. Mopping the sweat from my brow, I hurried to my next appointment with Representative Stephen Lynch. Gradually, after speaking to a number of staffers in different offices, I began to realize that almost none of them, no matter how long their political career or how sophisticated their understanding of environmental affairs, had ever heard of a revenue-neutral carbon tax. I was grateful for having CCL's advice to read as much as I could on the subject so that I could explain the concept in some detail and answer questions. This was nerve-wracking, however. At first, I was simply too nervous to think clearly. My mind went blank with stage fright, so I watched with awe as other more experienced CCLers politely set forth the agenda. My confidence slowly began to build. I realized that these staffers were not treating us as annoyances, impinging on their precious time. On the contrary, they seemed genuinely intrigued to learn that we were all unpaid and each made the journey to Washington on our own dime because we cared. 15 minutes often stretched into 50 as an aide asked penetrating questions that proved his or her engagement on the subject. We were repeatedly thanked for our efforts with seemingly real appreciation. Finally, on day 3, I found myself in the office of a more conservative representative from one of the western states. As we sat down with her aide, it once again became clear that while the Congresswoman might agree in principle with a revenue-neutral carbon tax, she and her aide believed there was simply no way that this Congress would enact one. Too many climate change deniers, he said, who just don't believe global warming poses a threat or is caused by mankind. I finally found my voice. You know, through volunteering with CCL, I've been privileged to meet a lot of economists at Harvard and at MIT. I began, still quite nervous, but capable of speech. One of them said something to me that I can't forget. He said, "We Americans are notoriously bad about buying insurance. We don't like to imagine that something bad could happen to us, especially if the odds are very low. That's why car and homeowners insurance have to be mandated. Let's say that the odds that global warming is caused by mankind are low. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that there's only a 1% chance that our kids will be negatively affected. A 1% chance that my children will inherit a planet with droughts, floods, food shortages, and resource wars is too high for me. I will buy that insurance plan, even if it causes me some real good discomfort. Because when did we Americans become unwilling to sacrifice for our children?" To my surprise, the aide was completely silent. He held my gaze for several moments and then murmured quietly to himself, "Time to buy insurance." He wrote down the words. I looked around the table, and my fellow volunteers were beaming at me. For the first time in a very, very long time, I had the feeling that as an individual citizen, I mattered. I might be rolling a stone up a hill, but unlike Sisyphus, I had the help of every other volunteer at CCL, and together, we were making forward progress. By exercising my civic birthright, I'm rediscovering the political power for which our ancestors fought and died. I can help build the national will to put a price on carbon. For that realization, for the support in helping me do it, I will be forever grateful to Citizens Climate Lobby. So we became extremely interested in trying to identify and celebrate those just extraordinary moments of people discovering their personal power and really finding that they have something to say in their government. You know, probably of all the things that people are cynical about, and people are cynical about a lot of things, there's probably nothing they're more cynical about than government and politics. And to throw that on its head and to watch what happens to people when they're part of throwing that on their head is just, it's It's the best thing I've ever seen happen. Now, seeing my children be born was pretty good. But this is really, really extraordinary. Judy Weiss, she's been with her CCL for 3 years. Last week she published her 400th letter to the editor.
Wow.
All of which are interesting, most of which are funny, from everywhere from the Boston Globe to the Aspen Times. I'm at a conference in Aspen and I'm looking through the paper. I always flip to the letter to the editor section wherever I had Judy Weiss! Of course she's published in the Aspen Times. She looks to get published everywhere.
Do you have a sense of what percentage people's letters to the editor are published?
No, I don't. Maybe you have a better sense of years of history on that.
All I would say was the obvious. If I'm writing my local paper rather than the big city paper, the percentage is often much higher. But
I think it's actually, if they're decently written letters and in the niche, they're fairly more common than you think. I think if somebody submits 2 or 3 letters, chances are they're going to get one published. In a lot of cases, I would say.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing for that is it's not just you're getting the message out, but particularly people the first time they get one. And I mean, they've sent it to their mom, their grandparents, you know, it goes all over the place. Look at this thing I did. It's a really nice way for people to get an early win, and in citizen advocacy, early wins are really important.
it cracks. I don't matter. I don't have a voice. No one will listen. It really cracks that open. Beginning to crack it open.
Yeah, and if you're taking on hard and big things, you're mostly going to be confronting your failure. So any success, like the first letter is, oh my God, look what I did.
I was specifically on, I mean, granted, we've had a hook, and it's probably easier than, you know, for instance, some of the work that global results volunteers do, but just in this push that we had around protecting SNAP, I was going to say 60 to 70% probably published.
Wow. I ran a letter to the editor campaign for the last 2 years, and we were getting like 1 in 9, but I think part of that is that we were talking about Iran, and there were some times where it was really exciting and sometimes where it was the last thing you want to talk about. But that has
one thing, Steve Balk, who you know was a longtime results volunteer and is now the head of our media. One of the things he's training us constantly on is the newspaper wants to have you respond to things that they say are the news. So if something's on the editorial page, it's a real good chance you're going to get published or respond to it. If you respond to the front page, it's also a really good chance. So what you should also train your people to do is look for things in the paper that beckon for you to write. Because the newspaper wants to feel like they're setting the tone of the news and that you're then responding to that. And if you'd like, Steve would be happy to do a media training for your group anytime you like. He loves doing that, he's really good at it, and you can do it in a short amount of time. Yeah. At the heart of the CCL and the results model are the group leaders, those are the people really working with volunteers. And what's the right balance of working with volunteers? And the thing that I love about this is most of our people who are group leaders, they don't have any management experience. So, you know, and it's not like managing a traditional organization, you're like, do it or I'll fire you. You know, it's like, you know, how do you...
You can't even dock their pay.
Yeah, you can't dock their pay, you can't, you know...
You can limit their coffee.
You can't kick them out of the organization, you know. So you have to find a way of working with people where you find a way of bringing them along. And I would say the 80-20 rule applies. You know, 80% of the things that happen in our organization, I'll bet it's the same with results, is because the group leaders make it happen. And then some of them are very good at also getting a lot of other people in their group to do so. So again, because we're always trying to get at context, you know, what's the world in which people are working in? We're always trying to find ways that we can give the group leaders tools of providing context for the work that they're doing in. And I love this example, it's one we share with our groups a lot, and I particularly like it because it's music-based because of Sam. So let me pass this around, and we'll do this more the Sam reading way, which I'll read a paragraph and then we'll each take one as we go along. So we'll go this way, and I'll read the first. Oh, here we go. There's more of these, sorry.
I have to agree with you too, Mark. I don't know that there's anything better in the world than seeing somebody who has been kind of diminished and sort of beat down by the problems in the world, thinking that they can't make a difference on them, actually have to call that into question.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, we were talking earlier just about how, you know, a lot of times we see the problems in the world, but we just don't know what to do about them.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, and again, wanting to see yourself as a person that's going to make a difference in the world, but then feeling that you just can't do it. It makes you a smaller human being.
Yeah.
That when that gets pushed away in some way, or it's like you actually have a chance to kind of grow as a human, you know, to realize your potential, I guess.
Yeah, one of our group leaders, Peter Joseph, says action is the antidote to despair. So it's, you know, it's the being in action that actually interrupts the, oh my God, you know, what a disaster this is and what a disaster my life is. You know, when I was doing the mission control program, I did one for the guy who wrote the chicken soup books, Jack Canfield, who's actually a much more complex, interesting guy than you would get from, I would never read a book like Chicken Soup because I get thrown out of my family. You know, we're very snobby about what we read. So, you know, you wouldn't be seen with a book like that. You know, whether they're good or not, I don't know. I can't read them because someone in my family might catch me. But he and his organization were very, very interesting people to work with. And one of the things that Canfield said is that he read some studies on the brain that said we have about 70 thoughts that wander by every day. Just all kinds of ones. About 80% of them are negative. 80% of them, it's not working out, I'm no good, you know, this is terrible, this will never happen. And so you have to find ways of intervening in that, knowing that's just the construct of human beings. The construct of human beings is mostly to see what's not going to work out about things. At any rate, so we keep trying to give models for the group leaders because the group leaders are really our access to the field. And in our view, everything has to happen in the field. We can't be a headquarter-driven organization. It has to be what actually happens there with the members of Congress, with the media, making talks to the public. So I think this is a really good model about how those leaders can lead their groups. This is an article called Jazz vs. Symphony by John Clarkson. Is there a leadership crisis? Are we really lacking executives to lead our organizations in the 21st century? Or are the specifications for the job changing? Should we re-examine what kind of leaders our organizations need? We'll just take a paragraph time.
Yeah. The critical function in today's organization is the creative function. As change accelerates, organizations that are not continuously recreating their reason for existence will not survive for very long.
Whether a business is driven by the need to increase variety or segment the market more finely, or cope with shortening life cycles, or harness the possibilities of new process technologies, or to reposition against new competitors, the key task is to lead the organization to create products, processes, and services that have not existed before.
Ken?
Oh, sorry, I thought he was reading. I thought you were still reading. Routine work can eventually be broken down into individual, repetitive, or ultimately unchanging tasks. Creative work requires harnessing the knowledge and thinking abilities of many people with different and highly specialized skills. In other words, professionals.
Most of our organizations today derive from a model whose original purpose was to control creativity. The Ford assembly line's virtue was that each man did one job the same way every time, without distractions, interactions, or self-expression. Today's organization follows a similar blueprint in maintaining walls between its specialized functions: marketing, manufacturing, engineering, finance.
And if you think of like one of our kind of volunteer chapters, you know, some people are media people, some people are research people, some like to meet with members of Congress, some don't. You know, people have their different affinities.
This suits many professionals just fine. Professionals of all types share a number of preferences: commitment to their specialty, insistence on autonomy, and the right to choose their work methods, and resistance to direction and evaluation by anyone other than their professional peers. Our modern organizations often encourage specialists to pursue the goals of their specialties at the expense of other functions, the firm, and the customer.
As a result, the biggest leadership challenge in business today may be leading specialized professionals from various functions to achieve the overall aims of the firm in a rapidly changing environment.
What kind of leaders are able to do this? Where might we look for examples? In the world of classical music, the symphony is regarded by many as its most complex creation, requiring the integration of a large assembly of highly talented individuals for its performance. It has been suggested that the CEOs of the future may resemble the great conductors.
There is one major flaw in this analogy. No one gives a CEO the music he should play, but American music suggests another possible answer.
Duke Ellington was not an unusually gifted individual unusually gifted individual or musical theorist. It is disputed how well he could read musical notation. Measured by his output of original compositions, he may be the dominant figure in 20th century music.
How is this prodigious creativity to be explained? From people who worked with him, it appears he learned how to forge the divergent personalities of his jazz group into a single, highly creative instrument.
Members of his band have described how he learned to create on the run. He would offer up a scrap of an idea, suggest in general what he wanted, and then rely on his players to take cues from each other and to fill in their parts as they thought best.
His players were good, but not without equal. He knew their quirks, their gifts, their problems, and he encouraged them to do things they didn't think they could do. Some players came and went, but many stayed for years. They developed through their membership in the group, and they learned from each other. Most of all, their capacity for innovation grew as they built on their cumulative experience.
Okay, that chapter is almost a perfect description of a volunteer group. You know, people come and go, there's people that do things, there's people that don't do things. I mean, that is how volunteer groups go.
Finally, by performing live in the close atmosphere of a jazz club, audience reaction and immediately visible to all, and refinement of new ideas came fast. On piano, Ellington was in the middle of the process, and communication was instantaneous. The results were astonishing.
The winning organization of the future will look more like a collection of jazz ensembles than a symphony orchestra. Functional barriers will be reduced. Different specialties will work more in permanent teams around specific customer opportunities. Customer contact will be continuous. Information will be current, rich, and available to all.
Leaders will be in the flow, not remote. Teamwork and cooperation will increase at the expense of individual competition. Cooperative support will moderate anxiety and encourage risk-taking. Talented people will be attracted by the ability to see and influence the whole process, to learn from others, other knowledgeable people, and by the opportunity to create and to grow.
The leaders who emerge from this environment will not look exactly like the old models. They will not necessarily excel at any one specialty. They will not have all the ideas. They will not be able to rely on exclusive decision-making authority, nor on the overwhelming force of personality, nor on a monopoly of information.
Leadership will flow to those whose vision can inspire the members of the team to put their best abilities at the service of the team. These leaders will create rather than demand loyalty. The best people will want to work with them. They will communicate effectively with a variety of people and use the conflict among diverse points of view to reach new insights. They will exert influence by the values they choose to reinforce. They will make leaders of their team members.
There are no set pieces anymore. The distinctions between composer, conductor, performer are eroding. The new leaders are all around us.
Okay, cool. So let's go back to one of Sam's rating systems in a little bit. So if you are training people in deep advocacy, on a 1 to 10 scale, how would you rate your own effectiveness in getting other people to trust others? Because this is really about trust, isn't it? This is the ultimate, not having to control everything. It's not that you shouldn't have your hand on the details, but at some point, to let people let it rip like this, you've got to trust that they're going to do what they do. So if you had to rate yourself not on your own capacity to trust other people, but on your capacity to convince other people that they should trust people, and that they should actually, they expand their capacity to have people, trust that they'll get things done. And, I don't know about your organizations, but I'm surrounded by control freaks. We're bouncing up this all the time. Now, it's good because a lot of details will be managed very importantly. But at the same time, we know that the volunteers can't express what they're really capable of unless they're trusted to take big pieces, and us be willing to live with the consequences if they don't do it the way I would do it. So let's just start this way. On a 1 to 10, how would you rate yourself in getting other people to trust other people?
Probably an 8.
Great.
It's a hard one.
Mm-hmm.
In the abstract, I think I'm really good at it,
Yeah.
but results are showing me it's maybe more like a 3 or 4.
Okay, thank you.
6.
Okay.
5.
Yeah.
5.
Okay.
Yeah, probably a 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, 7.
Mm-hmm.
5.
Yeah.
5.
Yeah. I don't know where I rate myself. I ask this myself every day. You know, are we giving enough power away? Are we trusting people? Are we willing to live with ourselves if it doesn't get them the way we think it needs to get done? If we trust a volunteer unsupervised to do it. So, any other questions or comments on that piece? Because I think it's a very, very good model at looking at how to particularly to empower working groups.
I just would say that this is probably one of the biggest struggles for an organization that wants to empower people.
Yeah.
It is, particularly when there are offices in Washington that are looking at policy and all that stuff that, you know, I regularly bump up against that, just so that it's like, you know, we need to free people.
Yeah.
How are you going to create political will in your community? Let's talk about some tools and whatever else. Like, how would you go about doing it? How are you going to move this member and really releasing that? And I think it's very easy to be in a place where if you're the policy people and you're the thinking through things, that it's like, well, they're never going to do it quite the right way, or they're never going to, you know, what if they don't say it right and whatever. It's like, I don't care if they say it right. They can hire and fire the person they're talking to and we can't.
Yeah.
You know, so it's, but again, I think this is one of the most challenging things about
My
this work.
question is, could you say anything about what you do or who you be, or you have this thought that I would have asked it this way, but instead, can you give any insights into a way you operate or be on a conference call with leaders, on a conference call with everyone, in a staff meeting that pushes roots in this direction?
Yeah. That's a really, really good question. So one of the things we're trying to get at all the time is we can live with how it goes when you go do this. So I trust you to go do this and do it the way it should be done. And at the same time, I think you have to stay true to, okay, so yeah, you could be a professional lobby organization in which you would have 2 or 3 people go to a meeting and, they would have done what they should do and everybody'd say it exactly the way you want. Or you could be an organization that says, I'm empowering citizens to deal with this. In which case, sometimes it's going to be sloppy and messy.
Yeah.
They're going to say things that we don't want, and sometimes they're going to say things that embarrass you, and sometimes it's like, oh my God, that's the worst thing that could ever happen. But I believe the empowering of the citizens is more important than the getting it right. So we try and set up a lot of conditions in which people can practice. We try and set up as many conditions as we can for people to rehearse. For this year's conference, we're even going to get them their schedule ahead of the conference, along with previous meeting notes, along with a chance to get together with teams. So you do everything you can to prepare as much as you can, and then just have to trust that they'll go do the right thing. And, they either will or they won't.
When you do your group launch meetings,
Yeah.
Group start workshop,
Yeah.
a big chunk of it is role-playing of planning of,
Yeah.
and then a role play of
Yeah.
a meeting with a member of Congress. I guess that's a signal.
Yes, so that's the start, but then we try and find as many conditions as we can for people to role play. I mean, there's just nothing like practice. There's nothing that touches it, and saying things out loud. And that's why I like this example of jazz. You really talk about getting immediate feedback if the audience didn't like it or not. That's why we want them to get in front of their congressional staffers as often as they can to find out what works or what doesn't work. I mean, I can't believe it. I've been in hundreds of meetings, and I made the most idiotic move yesterday at a Senate's office. We were making complete progress. Everything's going great, and we know that most Republican offices have dug themselves into a hole on science. So if you bring up the science, they immediately become defensive and just say ridiculous things that have nothing to do with anything based on science or reality, but they don't want to lose that argument, and that becomes more important. We've made all this roll, and I'm the idiot that brings up the science, and suddenly this meeting that's been great for 45 minutes is 100% defensiveness.
I thought we couldn't trust the volunteers.
Yeah,
You said
exactly.
trust.
Yeah, so no, I mean, mistakes are going to be made.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, we could talk more about this, but I think part of it is you have to get over the idea that there's one right way to do things.
Yeah.
Even for instance, the way that Sam would do a group start presentation is the right way for Sam to do a group start presentation, or the way Mark would start a
Yeah.
results group is the right way for Mark, but that doesn't mean it's the right way, even for me or a volunteer who's starting, doing an outreach present. And part of that's like personality and skills and strengths, and that's going to be true in lobby meetings, where people are bringing their own personality, skills, strengths, approaches, so I think part of it is out of the one right way idea of things.
Yeah. And again, I think it really has to do with trusting people. So this was a real important moment in our organization because we established our brand in that initial 3-hour training. It's not just going through a policy, but it is really establishing that really, no kidding, we are not going to be confrontational. This is going to be about finding what we have in common with people. And initially it was me and a few staff members who were doing it. And we couldn't get where we needed to get if we did that. And we didn't have the wherewithal to do the kind of training programs that we wanted to do. So we started training groups of what we call train the trainer over the phone. And now have 61 people around the world that can lead the group launch event. I never see them lead. That to me is a little bit scary of what are they talking about out there? So it's a big one of those ones of, okay, we trained them as best we could. We did have them rehearse a lot of points over the phone. So we'd say, okay, here's this section, we want someone to deliver it. And then we would have people give feedback on what worked or what didn't work. But nevertheless, they're out there then representing us, saying who we are as an organization. And, we simply don't have the wherewithal to go watch them do that. So that's to me, they're doing it great, I know they are. And one of the reasons we've tried to build some fun and joy into this, I think the reason that kids develop so much is there's so many things that they play at. And it's easy to develop when you're playing. When you're doing what you have to do, it's hard to get better at it. Because it's just, it's this grinding thing. So I do think it's important that we continually focus on, am I a better lobbyist this year? And I think it's easier for us to become better lobbyists if we find some ways of making the practice interesting or fun or joyous. It's why kids develop so fast. So much is play. I know it seems blasphemous to bring play to global warming because the planet's about to go to hell. But I just think our people develop faster if we find a way of doing that.
How do you do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to get my staff to do it not by talking about it, but by demonstrating it. When they're going to walk into a meeting, there's going to be something fun and joyous about it because they're there. I don't want people to say, hey, this should be fun. I want them to go in and make it fun. I want them to find something joyous or interesting or great because they're there, or because they're bringing joy to the party. Other people will find out that they can do the same thing.
On the letting go and actually on the joy. So we had a Hill briefing last month about survivors of trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was important to me that we have a survivor speak. And it was this convoluted process to identify this person, and I didn't control the process. So it resulted in I meet the person literally in the lunchroom in the basement of the building an hour before our event. And so she, as I had asked, had prepared her story, and because English is her second language, she had written it. So we're together in the lunchroom, and I'm saying, okay, so glad you're here, and to the joy, she had brought her mom and her sister. And they're thrilled, and they're dressed up, and it's wonderful, I'm going to the Capitol, and they had driven like 2 hours to get here. So I said, okay, so tell me how you're feeling, I want to support you, and let's go through your story. I read what you wrote. I was thinking, maybe you want to practice. She said, I want to read my story because I'm nervous. I said, that's fine. Here's a tip, while you're reading, periodically look up at the audience. I said, and you can just leave your finger so you don't lose your place when you come back. What if I get nervous? I said, well, I'm going to sit right in front of you, and I have a copy. So I'll know where you are, and I'll be, encouraging. And I said, even if you got completely upset and couldn't finish, I'll come up and stand by you, and I'll finish it for you. So don't even worry about that. It's going to be fine, and your mom's going to be right here. We have, so we're problem solving all these things that could happen, and we get to the event, and it's important to us as the agency. We're trying to forge these relationships. A lot of staffers came. We're thrilled with the turnout, and she gets up to the podium, and I give her the from the front seat, right? And I had told her, say your name first just to get yourself situated. And she does, and she goes off and tells, I don't know, a whole nother story. nothing that's on the page.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, so now I'm trying to listen to what she's actually saying, hoping it's on point.
Yeah.
Is it connected at all to
Yeah,
what we're doing?
yeah.
It sort of was. It wandered off a little bit. That was okay. In the end, what the staffers remembered was there was a survivor of trafficking there.
Yes. Wow.
And
Oh,
for
that's
me
great.
to
Yeah.
be like, well, she didn't tell the part about
Yeah,
the prosecutor.
yeah.
That was really important.
Yeah.
And her T visa.
Yeah.
It didn't.
Yeah.
So it, both the joy
I love
part.
the brilliance of your coaching, because
Oh.
your coaching is everything to try and make it okay so she can relax and talk, right?
Yeah.
Don't worry, I'll talk if you don't talk.
Yeah.
I'll stand here, put your finger there.
Yeah.
A lot of simple things that can just put her at ease a little bit.
And
Yeah.
she was so at ease.
Yeah,
To
amazing.
tell
She just went home. This whole other thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Did
I
you
mean,
celebrate with her after?
We did, and she was thrilled, and we took pictures,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
yeah. So
yeah.
she was, felt wonderful about having told what, her story. It was her story. She told her story.
We have some ways we think we want things to come across and how we think things are going to show up, but
Yeah.
we don't. You think about how she showed up for them. It was like this was a real person's life and
Yeah.
story and whatever else. And we heard from her personally. It's like, and that was the impact.
And they
ultimately.
never get that.
Yeah.
I mean, as you know,
Yeah,
a constituent, yes, a survivor.
yeah,
Jeez.
yeah. Amazing.
So
Yeah.
I want to ask a question about something a little bit different with volunteers. When it comes to trusting people to do okay when something's been set up, I have no problem with that. I have no problem telling a volunteer I've never met with, okay, you've got an appointment at the district office at 2 p.m. Make sure you're there, and I'll check
Yeah.
in with them before they go. That's fine. I trust them, and I know that it's more important for the person, for the staffer to meet with them than it would be for me
Mhm.
anyway. So I don't even feel the need to be there, right? But where I have trouble with is empowering my volunteers not as much to do a lobby day when I ask them to, but to help build their chapter and to help seek out additional opportunities. So when you said Rabbi Weiss had her 400th letter to the editor published, somebody on staff probably didn't call her each 400 times because it's a ridiculous amount of work. So
Yeah.
how do you build them up to the point where they are doing that on their own? How do I
Yeah.
get, I think of one person in Indiana who's so passionate and he loves it and he loves doing the lobby thing, but every time I try to talk to him, like, well, who can you get to go with you is when he
Uh-huh.
like freezes
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
So how, and that's something that I can't from DC, I don't know who would, I don't know who
Yeah.
the community leader is in his small town. I don't know whether people go to the farmer's market or whether they go to.
Some people are organizers and some aren't.
Yeah.
So it might be the person is a really good person, but someone else is an organizer that would need to round up some other people.
Yeah.
So it does change the dynamic when it becomes a group of people, and they begin to take care of all that stuff.
Yeah.
So the answer with an individual is a hard answer, but if you could somehow convince them that if they could get a group of people who are then celebrating their successes together and picking each other up when they fall
We'll
down.
get into that after
Okay.
lunch, the
Good.
structures
Okay.
of groups
Okay.
and.
Good.
Though I would say that there's probably, there's other things you could do even with an individual. Like, let's say especially, like, there isn't a group there. You assess strategically, groups are important, but this district isn't where I want to spend a bunch of time building something.
And that's actually
Clearly, I
what
don't
I'm
have
thinking
the
about.
person
One
who's gonna
person.
Yeah.
spend a bunch of times. But for instance, if you go, it's better if it's within the organization, but sometimes it's like, well, I just heard about somebody at a training who's had 400 letters. Like, we have a similar guy right now in Results who's going gangbusters, and he got published in like the Costco newsletter. Like, he every time.
Times.
And the New York
And the New York Times and the
Is there any
Advocacy.
difference between those two?
Well, and he's like, he's like a Johnny Appleseed, because every time he's visiting some random family
Yeah,
member
yeah.
in some random small town somewhere on the West Coast, he's got a letter to the editor published like 2 weeks later. And part of it is like sharing those stories, because then I think people don't think like, they think like, oh, I'm not supposed to do that, or like when you share stories of creativity, I think it will lend itself. And stories of folks just kind of making it up and going gangbusters, I think it'll lend itself to other things. So making sure that we're kind of sharing that might help
Yeah.
It's not going to lead to a chapter in this random small Indiana
But
town.
it's still feeling like you're part of something. That's
Right.
Not just you.
It might mean that he goes out and is at every town hall meeting within a 50-mile radius because he found out where they were and he goes there proactively or whatever. Like there's something that's up his, that's appropriate for him that he goes for because he's hearing about other people doing some random interesting things.
Okay, there's one other piece that I want to make sure we get to. So over the last 2 years, we've been working on 4 layers of what we call listening. The first is just the really simple part, which is, hey, try listening, it might work. I know we're all super interesting people. We have so many interesting things to say, but you've been out to someone for coffee sometime and they talk for the whole first hour and you say, if I never see them again, my life will be better. But then you've had people that all they did is ask you questions, ask interested, and you walked away and you said, I don't really know anything about them, but this is the most amazing person I've ever met. And so we've been working on just can we expand our capacity to be curious and be interested rather than interesting people. So getting better at just immediately observing something about someone and asking a few questions and seeing how much we can continue to have the attention focused on that person rather than ourselves. I just think you'll be more successful with people if we can do that in all cases. And so we've been working on an organization is expanding our curiosity. So I try it and practice everywhere. So you're in the elevator. Well, isn't that interesting outfit you have on today? Where'd you get that? Or in the grocery store. I find that there isn't any place where you can't work on interviewing people and seeing if you can expand your ability to draw them out rather than talk. And part of why I think that's important is, particularly in meetings with members of Congress, volunteers are really excited and they all want to get their 2 cents in. But probably it's more important for us to go in there and discover that we can actually be interested and listen rather than having to get our 10 points in, particularly if we want them to invite us back. If we want them to invite us back, probably if we sound like the people who actually heard them, rather than 5 of us all got our 10 points in and then, oh my God, we have to go over the meeting because we haven't got all our points in. We try to be really, really, really disciplined that before there's any sense that we're done with the meeting, that we say, wow, thank you for meeting with us. So if it looks like the meeting was a half hour at 20 minutes, saying, gosh, I can't believe you took this much time for us. So that any time we're going to go over than a small amount of time, it's because they've said, no, please stay here. That we never just talk and talk and talk and outweigh our welcome. We're always looking for any signal that says they're getting close to being done so we can say, we could get you tons of information later. So that we'd be the kind of people they'd say, we can't wait to have these people back because they don't use up our time by talking us to death. I used to have this friend who's saying being talked to death is a terrible death, and I think he's right. Okay, so the first part of listening is what I just want to call listening. And that is, can we get better at spending more time hearing other people rather than hearing ourselves? Okay, the second part of listening is what's in the background that nobody has to say out loud but everybody knows. So I'm going to refer back to the area that I worked in before, which was trying to get people to enjoy their work, to be fulfilled by it. But there's all this debilitating language around work that just kills people. So for instance, there was a construction project close to my house, about 2 blocks, and I would walk my dog every morning, and this would be a typical conversation I would have with a guide. I'm walking up the street with my dog, I always say hi to him, I say, good morning, how you doing? And he says, it's Monday. Now, what's all the other stuff you don't have to say out loud, but everybody agrees when you say it's Monday?
Work stinks.
Work stinks, right? And it's unassumed, and you know what? Even for people who like their job, they work in a world called life stinks. I mean, work stinks. And the same thing, I walk by him sometimes, I say, how you doing? He says, it's Friday. It's like, oh my God, this terrible misery is over. So there's all these things that nobody says out loud, but that are assumed that shape what we can see and think and hear with people. Okay, so how does that affect you and I? Well, you and I go into a meet with a member of Congress and we say it's a tea partier. And there's a good chance we don't hear the person because we hear the concept called that person's a tea partier. And we therefore automatically assume we know everything about them, and we're not listening to that human being anymore. We're listening to reinforce our notion of what tea partiers are like. We become very ineffective with them. So we should examine our predisposed ideas about Republicans, Democrats, progressives, Tea Partiers, understand our own biases so that we have a better chance of actually connecting with a human being. Okay, but it goes both ways. In my world, in the climate activist world, what do Republican members of Congress know about me?
Yeah.
I'm a crazy person. I'm a crazy, alarmist, detached from reality. You know, I was watching the news one day and Obama was giving a speech on health care and some of the people in the audience yelled him down about the pipeline. Okay? I wasn't in that meeting, but in the views of a lot of members of Congress, I was. I'm the screaming, crazy, irrational person. So it really goes two ways. One is we need to be aware of our own predisposition before other people open our mouth, and we need to know what they think about us. That's why I tell our volunteers, you are going to wear a shirt and tie when you go to that meeting. You are not wearing your Che Guevara shirt into the meeting. I know you look great in your Che Guevara shirt. Nothing brings out the best of you than wearing your Che Guevara shirt. But you are not wearing into those meetings. You're wearing, if you only have one shirt and tie, you're wearing that shirt and tie. Because we've got to take away that we're the crazy people. Okay, so there's a lot of things that are going along before we even open our mouth, and it's important for us to be aware of it so that we know what we're talking into. Because that tells you what you can be heard, where you're credible on, what you're not credible on. Okay, then I want to get to one other piece, and I want to do an exercise on this one.
What was the 4?
I have 4 levels.
Okay,
One,
so
we're just shut up and listen.
Yep.
2 is
What's in the
increase your
background?
awareness of what's in the background, both about you and them.
Yeah.
Okay, the 3rd is...
Okay, sorry, I thought I missed all 4.
No, we're
You're
I know,
in the
sorry.
middle there. Okay.
Now we're on 3.
Okay.
Three is what I call the difference between stingy and generous listening. So we're going to do an exercise in a minute, and here's what we're going to do. You're going to share something you're really excited about. Okay? So it could be a movie you went to recently. It could be a book you read. It could be a meeting with a member of Congress. It could be the growth of your organization. In my case, my first grandson was just born 2 months ago. You know, we're out of our minds about that. I mean, like, out of our minds. Every single day, we're like, you know, Katie, we forgot to drop this by. So we can go by and just hold him for a minute. So it's something that you're generally excited about. Now, what's going to happen when we pair up? You're going to listen, but you're going to listen in 2 ways. The first time you're going to listen is what I call stingy listening. And in stingy listening, you listen kind of like how teenagers do. You know, like whatever you say is the least interesting thing I've ever heard. And so you're going to share whatever you share, and we're only going to do that for about 30 seconds because it's kind of painful. Then the second kind of listening we're going to do is what I call generous listening. And in generous listening, you hear the same thing, but you decide in advance that you're going to kind of be blown away by what the person shares. You know, it's like you've never heard someone talk about that. Wow, you went to that movie. I can't believe that movie had that effect on you. I can't imagine what it'll do to me. So what we want to observe is there a difference in what the person can communicate based on the way you listen? Does it influence what and how they can communicate based on how you're relating to what they say? And then the other thing we want to observe is this. Is it easier for you to be stingy or generous? And if you find it far easier to be stingy, that might be something you might want to go to work on. Possibly. You might want to work on. So what we're going to do is an exercise in just a minute.
Okay.
And everybody's going to share something they're really excited about. And then the person who's listening is the first time they're going to listen is what I call stingy listening. And that's kind of like if you've ever raised children, at some point they become teenagers and you become the stupidest human being on earth. And you can do that with body language. You can do it the way that you say. So let's say I was paired up with Sam and I said, Sam, I'm so excited. You know, my grandson was just born 2 weeks ago. And he says, yeah, you know, all those end up turning into pot-smoking teenagers anyway. So I don't know what you're so excited about. So you can do it with body language. You can do it with what you say. So then once we do that for about 30 seconds, then I'll say switch. And we want to share the exact same thing. And this time the person who's listening is listening with generous listening, which is you're just deciding you're going to be blown away. That what they're saying is so interesting you can't believe it. And we want to observe, A, does it change the communicator based on how you listen? And 2, is one or those easier than the other? Okay? So whoever has the Let's see. Whoever's got the hair that's most like mine, you're going to go first.
To give feedback or ask, oh, that's so interesting. That even took some of the time, but still, I got more information.
Interesting.
I felt like with the journalist one, she was more interested by her asking me what the IAC was. So that means she really wants to know more about what I'm talking about. So that gives me more.
What you're willing to share when somebody's listening to you stingily is less. I mean, you're just like, you know.
It's painful.
Yeah, it's sort of like, they don't really want to hear this, and you kind of just, so you don't share things.
Yeah.
They just don't come forward.
I found myself when he was doing stingy listening trying to get his attention. So I asked him a question actually when I was doing that to,
Okay, good. And then, you know, we're not going to make anybody admit it, but if you discovered in that it's easier for you to be stingy again, that could be something you can go to work on. Okay, so,
One unusual thing to me that I noticed by myself, when I was stingy listening, I felt kind of comfortable, like comfortably hidden. You know, like I can just talk and it doesn't matter what I say. But she's hardly even paying attention anyway. But then when she was being a generous listener, it was not as comfortable. You know, I was like, I kind of lit up. Okay, it really matters what I say, everything, because it's sort of kind of there's a light on it.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Okay, so we've done. Yeah.
One challenge that I have with generous listening is I'm really bad at remembering details, so I'll like want to ask people about it, but then I probably won't remember it after, and that's like or maybe won't remember it, but will try to remember really hard, and that's a challenge that I have as generous listener.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so first level is shut up and listen. Second level is what's in the background that colors what can be seen or heard, etc. Third is, does it matter the way you listen? And I think it's obvious it does. It matters. So the fourth is, what's most fundamental that's in the background that's there before anybody opens their mouth, anytime, you or anybody else? And the most fundamental thing that's always there as a background thing that's registering all time is having to be right and avoid being wrong. That's what's there for everybody. For every single person that's there. And the reason I bring it up is so that when you look at constructing the discussions you're going to have with members of Congress, if the nature of your discussion is the only way is that you've constructed it so that if you win, they what? Lose. Yeah. And people don't like that. People don't like that at all. So you should know that going into every conversation, they don't want to come out the loser, and neither do you. So what we've discovered in our organization, with respect to talking to Republicans, anytime the science comes up, if the science gets discussed, there has to be a winner and a loser. And nobody wants to lose. So we just realized it's just a bad place for us to go. There's all kinds of things that we talk about that don't have to force them in a position of either winning or losing a discussion. So if they bring up the issue and they say, well, you know, I don't think the science is settled. We don't say, no, the science is settled. 97% of climate scientists are convinced, based on the evidence, that man-made global warming is happening, which is an accurate statement. The problem is it just boxes them in. So what we say is, you know what, we'd be happy to come up back a different time, and we could bring a scientist from the University of Alabama you'd like to, but what we'd like to do today is talk about a policy that's good for the economy, good for the air, and grows jobs. So it's not like you don't pretend they don't say it, but why go down there given all it's about is about an argument? So there are 4 layers that we should be working on all the time. We recommend. One is, let's see if we can become more interested people, rather than...
Could I ask this question? But
yes.
You did this with me over the phone before, and you said, and I want to ask you about this, but we'd be happy to bring a scientist from the University of Alabama along. So is that true in that, you know...
You would be happy to do it?
Well, if I'm a member of Congress and I'm Alabama member of Congress, I would be open to talking to a University of Alabama professor.
The reason we use that term specifically is because, you know, things are very tribal right now, right? You're either on my team or you're against my team.
Right.
The people who argue against scientists are kind of anti-scientists, but they like the people in their state.
Right.
They think their people in their state are more like them. So we do that simply to deal with that dynamic and say, we could bring local people, and we'd be happy to.
Yeah. And you would?
Yes, and we would.
So in this example, your ask is that they support this legislation?
Yes.
Which is, do you know what it is? Because it's not an easy one.
Yeah, yes.
Steadily
because
rising.
I read the name.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I'm thinking about last summer when my ask was to stand down.
Mm-hmm.
Some Republican representatives in South Florida where we wanted to have the unaccompanied children go, and I just wanted them to stand down because another Republican in a different district where he heard we looked at a property, he had a press conference, he did an op-ed, he called it, he went on. And so all I wanted them to do was be educated, here's what we're thinking, I'm gonna share information, and if you can't support and come out and sign on to the grant proposal, could you just,
Yeah.
does that feel like as valid an ask as I want you to sign on to something?
I think you always have to move people from where they are to where you think you can get them. So like our people in Texas say, we don't ever expect that our Texas senators would vote for the kind of legislation we're proposing. If we could get them to agree that they wouldn't filibuster when it got to the floor, that may be as far as we could ever get. So I think it's important to take people where they are and move them to where you think you can move them, because everybody's not going to get exactly where you want. So I think it would be a really good ask. Okay. I think I'm out of time.
So here's the question.
Yeah.
We're going to do a break and lunch.
Uh-huh.
Can you stay so we could do a Q&A on
I can stay
what-
through lunch.
Yeah,
okay.
that's what I meant.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you
Yeah, thank you.
very much.
Thank you all very much.
Very
That was
good.
very